Hello. Sometimes people misunderstand Jesus. They see him as this super nice guy, as if he's just always like super kind. Yet the reality is, he's also the guy who gets angry and flips tables. Why would he ever do that? Why would a gracious person, gracious God, ever flip tables? Well, for that, we're going to explore today.
Breaking chains, burning ships, drowning in grace. This is Three Nails X. Breaking chains, burning.
Welcome back. And today we're exploring the temple clearing. We're going to look at Mark's version of Jesus' last kind of days on earth. And so in our last episode, we covered Sunday, the triumphant entry. Today, we cover Monday, the temple clearing itself. So let's get started. We'll start with reading the passage, Mark 11, 9 through 25. It's a little bit longer of a passage and has this very interesting fig tree in it. Fig tree kind of Markan sandwich there. And so, here we go. The next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off. So he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the tree, "May no one ever eat your fruit again." And the disciples heard him saying it. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, 'My temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have turned it into a den of thieves." When the leading priests and teachers of the religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning how to kill him. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teachings. That evening, Jesus and the disciples left the city. The next morning, as they passed by the fig tree he had cursed, the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to the tree on the previous day and exclaimed, "Look, Rabbi, the tree you cursed has withered and died." And so the big question that we have to start asking is, what does a fig tree have to do? What does it have to do with the temple? You see, this is a Markan sandwich. We have our first story, right? Story number 1 here. And sandwiched in the middle is this temple clearing. And so what does the fig tree have to do with anything? And that's a question we're going to turn to in a little bit, but I want you to keep that in mind on the backdrop. And so, what does the fig tree teach us about the clearing of the temple? Before we even get to that, I want to just show you very quickly what the temple itself kind of would have looked like, the Temple Mount. And so this here is the Temple Mount during Jesus' day. It is 26 football fields long. So from here, not long, but the area is 26 football fields. So this area all on top is 26 football fields. This is crazy big. The temple itself is this kind of area here, with this outer court all up in here being the Gentiles' courtyard. And so a Gentile could go up to about this wall right here. You can see a little wall right here, where they could go up to that point and worship. They could not go past that point unless they were Jewish. If you went into this area here, you had to be Jewish. If you did not, if you were not Jewish, if you were not circumcised, you would be put to death if they figured out that you went in there. And so it's a serious thing to go into the temple kind of area. But I just want you to think this, just realize how much care they put into this area. So for example, just the stairs to get up into the temple which is kind of these things that come up through the floor here. There's stairs right here that go down into the foundation. These stairs themselves, they actually designed off-center, or varying like depth of each step by a few inches. And they did it because if you tried to go up steps where each step is a different size and you're not paying attention and you're going super fast, you'll actually trip. And the whole point was that you could not rush into God's presence. You couldn't rush. You had to slow down. You had to take your time to enter into that area, which is hugely significant for today, because so often today we will rush into God's presence. We will rush into church, we'll rush into the area, and we don't even realize what we're doing. We don't reflect on what we're doing and where we're going and the God that we're meeting. So we just kind of like run into his presence. We need to slow down and remember. Okay, so anyway, we got this Gentile courtyard where only the Gentiles can go. Now, a little bit more on the temple. If we ended up zooming in, this here is where they would sacrifice animals. And if you were a Jew, you could worship all in here. And to sacrifice your animal, you would come through the doors and you would wait right kind of behind this line here where you would watch your animal get sacrificed. And so Jews could get really, really close to watching the sacrifices happen and all of that, but Gentiles could not. You could go in here to worship, but Gentiles could not go in here to worship. Now, to get a slightly different perspective, we're going to end up reading John's version of the temple clearing and kind of compare them and tie it all up in the end with what the temple has to do with anything. So, jumping into John's version of the temple clearing, John 2:13 through 22. It says, "It was nearly to the time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves. He also saw dealers," it's interesting, "at tables exchanging foreign money. So Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers." Okay. He scatters the money changers all over the floor. He turned their tables. Then going to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures. "Passion for God's house," sorry, that should be capital G, "God's house will consume me." But the Jewish leaders demanded, "What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it." "All right," Jesus replied, "destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." "What?" they exclaimed. "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days?" But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus said. So, a few things happening here. Notice there are two big problems that Jesus has with the temple and what is happening. Number one, he says, "My house should be a place of prayer, a place of worship. You've made it into a marketplace." So that's the first problem. They've made it into a marketplace. But we learned in Mark's that they also made it a den of robbers, or like a den of thieves. And so there's two things I think happening here. One has to do with the area of worship, or the area of selling the cattle and such. And so if we looked kind of closely and realized what's going on here, we would realize that when it comes to the temple, they were selling their animals right in here at the Gentile courtyard. And so when you think about it, if this is as far as you could go as a Gentile and you are worshiping here, imagine people trying to sell animals right next to you. Think of it almost like this. The next time you're in church, or the next time you're in like a chapel or something like that, imagine someone just like standing up during prayer and having a loud conversation about trying to sell you coffee. If they were very loud and were like, "Oh yeah, buy your coffee at the place down the street, it's $2, I'll give you a discount for $1," like, If that was happening while you're trying to pray in church, it would not go over well. You would not be able to pray. That's the problem that Jesus has. One big problem is that Gentiles can't worship because the area that they worship is taken over. It's a marketplace. And they shouldn't be selling up here anyway. There are chambers underneath the Temple Mount where you could sell. There are also stores where you would sell outside of the Temple Mount as well, on the outskirts, right around before you go in. So you can very easily still sell animals at a reasonable price not too far away. And so Jesus has those two problems happening, right? And we kind of see it here that he says, "My temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations. You've turned it into a den of thieves." So it's not a prayer, it's not a house of prayer for all nations. They have intentionally, deliberately kind of ruined that. Now, in both versions, you see this very interesting doves are treated differently. You see, I think the other thing that's happening here, which many commentators I read said, oh yeah, that has happened in other points in history, but we don't really know if that's happening here. I think, given Jesus' words, "you made it a den of thieves," is that there's some economical issues happening here. You see, what is the cheapest animal of the three? If we have cattle, sheep, and doves, what do you think is the cheapest? The doves. Cattle are the most expensive, usually. Sheep are second most expensive. And doves are your third. They're your cheapest. And so notice that Jesus doesn't drive out the doves. He kind of just says, get these things out of here. You see, there was a few ways that the kind of religious leaders, the people selling and all of that, can make extra money and really take advantage of the situation. You see, first, the animal you had to have was unblemished to sacrifice it. And for it to be unblemished, the priests and all that would have to check it. Well, throughout history, at some other points in history, they would make a little bit of money and be in league with those selling the animals. And so they could say, your animal's unblemished, you need to buy from those others. Now, even if that's not happening, and at some points in history that was not happening, even if that's not happening, if you were traveling many miles to Jerusalem, if you were bringing an unblemished animal, it most likely would be blemished by the time you got there. Like, there would be something that would happen that would make it blemished, and then you'd have to buy from kind of the animals on the Temple Mount and such. But when you think about it, if you have a monopoly on the supply of an item that is high in demand, what can you do with the prices? Jack them up. You see, you could raise the prices astronomically if there's high demand and you have the supply. That is very much what happens at the temple, because you couldn't just bring any animal. They had the supply. And everyone had to sacrifice to make atonement for their sins, so they had high demand. And so that's the second way that they could be ripping people off. And the third way has to do with money changers. You could not buy these animals with Roman coins. You had to trade out your coins. You had to switch them out. And so when you think about it, when you go to a foreign country, what do you do with your money? You exchange it for their currency. When you do places do it for free? No. They charge an interest, or they charge a fee. Usually it's very low. It's like less than 1%, sometimes 1% in many countries. When I went to Costa Rica a few months ago, it was very, very low exchange kind of rate fee that you would get at most places. But there's still an exchange rate fee. So when you think about it, if you were not super wealthy and you brought your own animal because you weren't super wealthy, it most likely would become blemished. So then when you hit the temple, you would have to buy their animal. And they could just jack up the prices because they knew you had to buy from them. And then on top of that, before you bought from them, they made you exchange the coins. So then they can charge an interest there. So if you could afford a sheep, by the time this process is done, if you could normally afford a sheep, you would only be able to afford a dove. Jesus does not have a problem with temple sacrifices. He's not angry with that. He's angry that they are making it hard for Gentiles to worship. And then when you also think about it, he is making the statement of doves, right? They're not driven out. He kind of watches out for the doves. He's making the statement that, like, you are making God, you are making worship, you are making temple sacrifices. You're making it inaccessible to the poor. That is a big deal. And so this kind of idea of the focus on clearing out the sheep and oxen without the doves, it is to emphasize the manipulation of prices that oppress the poor, or to oppress the poor. And so Jesus has this major problem of heavy emphasis on worship being hindered, both of the poor and the Gentiles, as ultimately the prices made the religious leaders rich at the expense of the common person. People are making money. It is a smart business idea. But it still shouldn't be. See, Jesus is doing a symbolic action directed against the economic powers of the temple aristocracy. Right? They misuse this temple. They carry on business for profit when they didn't have to. They're taking advantage of people. And so sometimes when people read this story, they're like, Jesus gets so upset. He shouldn't get so upset. But we should be upset if people only sold the gospel of Jesus, if they only told people about the gospel of Jesus, and they only told it to, or made it accessible to, the rich, then it's not the gospel, because Jesus also came for the poor. And so these are things that we should know. Now, by flipping tables and driving people out, Jesus is passing judgment on the temple. He is using both Isaiah and Jeremiah, this type of language, to make his point. The people have gone astray. When Jesus does this action, they know exactly what he's getting at. He is cursing the temple. He's saying it's going to be destroyed. Similarly to the way Jeremiah did it, that it's going to be destroyed. Which then we go back to the big question we kind of had at the start. What does a fig tree that is cursed have to do with the temple? Well, think about the fig tree for a moment. Its leaves were sprouting. They were budding, which means it looked like it should have fruit. But it wasn't the season for it. But it still looked good. Jesus walks over, and even though it looks good and it's not the season, there's no figs on it. There's no fruit. And so Jesus curses it. Ultimately, it gets destroyed. Which is where then the end of the Markan sandwich. They're passing back by, and the fig tree is cursed. It's destroyed. It's been withered. It's totally gone. It's kind of destroyed. The temple's very similar. It looks great. The leaves are budding. It looks like it kind of should. Looks like there would be worship happening. But when you get closer, when Jesus got closer, he realized there's no fruit. And the season for the temple was ending anyway, because Jesus is the new temple where God's Spirit dwells. And so what does the fig tree have to do with the cursing of the tree? Think of the fig tree as if it is the temple. It looks good, but it bears no fruit. And therefore the fig tree was cursed and will be destroyed. It's destroyed. The same is true for the temple, and Jesus is that new temple. So what do we do with our lives? You see, one of the things we can apply this with, and hopefully you can think of some other applications outside of this, but one thing is we must make worship accessible to all, not just the rich, or not just to people who look like us, or not just to people who talk like us. He's got to be accessible to all. Do not hinder other people's worship. God wants to be worshiped. He doesn't like it when worship is hindered, especially if we are the ones doing it. Thirdly, Christ is the new temple. We are also the temple of the Holy Spirit, which is why Paul uses that language that your body is a temple, because God's Spirit also now dwells in you. And so if we're looking at the last week of Jesus's life, we can get a brief, quick timeline here by just going Sunday, triumphant entry, Zechariah 9:9 fulfilled. What do they expect him to do? They expect him to be king. They expect him to set up a throne after clearing out the temple, but instead he gets up there and just leaves. Monday, he clears the temple. We just covered that, pronounces judgment. Tuesday is the temple debates, where in the next few videos we will look at how Jesus debates, because we can learn things from how Jesus debates and improve our own kind of debating and arguing tactics. And then Wednesday is this kind of unknown day. Some people think he rested. If Jesus was crucified on Friday, then he rested on Wednesday. We don't really have an account there. But the Jews actually believe, many Messianic Jews believe, that the Last Supper actually starts Wednesday. Jesus was crucified Thursday. And then he's in the grave by the end of Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday, and he rose again on Sunday. So that's a kind of Messianic Jewish perspective, that the Last Supper starts on Wednesday. But this is the timeline. This is where we are going. I will see you next time.
Breaking chains, burning ships, drowning in grace. This is 3 Nails X.